Breaking down the findings in online publication Unheard, Professor at Stanford School of Medicine, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, writes, these preliminary results stand in sharp contrast to the unambiguous message from public health agencies and governments worldwide, which granted emergency authorization to the vaccines based on evidence from the trials that the vaccines reduce the likelihood of getting symptomatic COVID. From a public health perspective, prevention of COVID symptoms is not as important as prevention of death or disease transmission, which the randomized trials did not study. But despite the significance of her findings, Professor Stabell Benn feels there just isn't the correct level of interest. Speaking to Unheard, she said, I have been in this game now for almost 30 years studying vaccines and finding these non-specific effects which have been very controversial. There are strong powers out there that don't really want to hear about them. But to me, this is good news. It means that we can optimise the use of vaccines to not only be strong protective efforts against vaccine disease, but we can also optimise their use in terms of overall health. Well, I'm delighted to say that Professor Christine Stabell Benn joins me now. Professor, really fascinating results. Obviously, I know it's early days. There's a lot more work to be done. But when you look at all-cause mortality, do you feel comfortable to say now that it doesn't look like the mRNA COVID vaccines, you know, the vaccines by the likes of Pfizer and Moderna, were as good as, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccines?
Just to give you a bit of background, our group has for decades studied the overall health effects of vaccines, their effects on overall mortality. We've done that in an African context with high mortality, and there it became very evident that vaccines, in addition to protecting against the vaccine disease, also have effects on the immune system, which affect how the immune system subsequently respond to a broad range of other unrelated diseases. These effects we've called non-specific effects. They are generally accepted now in research among researchers, but unfortunately this knowledge has not really come into the systems for testing and approving the vaccines, also new vaccines. So that means that we actually don't have the studies to actually document the full health effect of vaccines before they are being tested, launched, and used in large populations.
because to be clear, your argument is that the vaccines might work or not work, but in this case, they do work against what they are meant to work for, COVID-19, but they have other effects on the body sometimes too.
Other effects, yes. They might
positive and negative.
Yes, so what we've seen is that in general, the pattern we have observed is that live attenuated vaccines, which contain the pathogen in a weakened form, these live vaccines can strengthen the immune system and the general health of the children who receive it so that they're better.
So that's the AstraZeneca jab, to be clear.
We were actually not sure about either the AstraZeneca or the other adenovirus vector vaccines or the mRNA vaccines for that sake, because these are two new vaccine types. So what we saw was the live vaccines were beneficial. The non-live vaccines, I should say, we saw that they were actually harmful in the sense that they, particularly for girls, they came and protected against the vaccine diseases, but they could actually come at a high cost, namely the increased risk of other diseases in the females for reasons we are still trying to understand.
Which we must understand. And just to clarify, Christine, sorry, when you say non-live, are you referring to the mRNA vaccines there like Pfizer and Moderna?
No, well, what I'm trying to say is that we didn't know right from the beginning with those two new types of vaccines, both the adenovirus vectors vaccines and the mRNA vaccines, whether they would behave as live or non-live. We were actually in doubt because both of them are, in principle, they're new vaccines and they could have behaved like live vaccines. What we see now when we are looking at the overall mortality effect of the vaccines and compare them to each other, then there is a highly statistically significant difference in their effect on overall mortality. So what we see is that the adenovirus vector vaccines like the AstraZeneca reduce all-cause mortality much more than explained just by the prevention of COVID death. And they also reduce cardiovascular death. In general, they reduce all the non-COVID, non-accident deaths significantly also. So this suggests that the adenovirus vector vaccines, even though the adenovirus has been engineered so that it doesn't replicate, it isn't really live in the sense that it can behave like a live virus, it nonetheless seems to stimulate the immune system. At least that's a hint that they might stimulate the immune system beneficially and generally improve the health of the recipients beyond their effect on COVID-19. But in contrast, we don't see this effect of the mRNA vaccines. I have to emphasize that the vaccines weren't tested against each other. That's actually what we're advocating, that we need to have studies now comparing head-to-head recipients of the
absolutely.
Those who received adenovirus vector vaccines with those who received mRNA vaccines. Because if we are anywhere near the truth with this effect, it actually has enormous public health implications.
Well, it does indeed. And I just wanted to pick up a little bit more on that point regarding the mRNA vaccines. So the trial data shows that there was hardly any statistically meaningful evidence that the mRNA vaccines reduced all-cause mortalities. And that's because there was an increase, at least in your sample, of cardiovascular deaths in particular. Do you have any way of knowing whether those cardiovascular deaths are connected to the mRNA vaccine?
No, and I don't have any possible way of saying that the vaccines are protecting or not protecting or increasing all-cause mortality because numbers are so small. So this is the real pity. This is because the system for testing vaccines doesn't demand that there is also a demonstration of effect on all-cause mortality, because the trials were large, but they were stopped after a few months when they started vaccinating the control groups. So we only have short follow-up. We only have a total of 31 deaths in the mRNA trials, the Pfizer and the Moderna trials. So that is absolutely too little to say. We can say they aren't. They are distributed with 16 deaths in the mRNA group and 15 in the placebo group. And overall, there's no indication that there's a reduction of all-cause mortality. But the confidence interval, as we call it, around this estimate is so broad that it doesn't exclude that there could be a quite a strong beneficial effect of these vaccines on all-cause mortality. But on the other hand, it doesn't exclude either that there could be an increase in overall mortality. What we see for cardiovascular diseases is a 45% increased risk of dying from cardiovascular diseases in the mRNA group versus the placebo group. But again, the confidence intervals are very, very broad. It doesn't exclude a beneficial effect of these vaccines on cardiovascular death either.
I know.
So I think our bottom line here is that we don't have the data to say anything about the overall health effects of mRNA vaccines, but that is obviously a big problem since we're now distributing.
Exactly. To everyone. We're all being expected to be jabbed, some people 4 or even 5 times now. So that's why I just want to ask you finally, Professor, what you mean by this comment. There are strong powers out there that don't really want to hear about your results. Are you talking about big pharma there? Are you talking about organizations like the World Health Organization? Because to me, this research that you've done is utterly critical, and people should be pouring resources into it to make sure that we find out.
I completely agree. I think the big powers are both big pharma and also the public health institutions, because you can see I love the potential in these studies, these non-specific effects, the potential we have for improving vaccination schedules and actually making them cleverer and more useful, etc. But I think they are raising some challenges to big pharma and to public health in terms of how vaccines are tested and regulated and approved. And that goes for new vaccines being developed. It actually also goes for the vaccines we have already, because, unknown to most people, none of the vaccines that we use today in vaccination programs globally were assessed for their effects on overall health before they were being introduced. So everybody was so sure at that time that vaccines did nothing but protect against the vaccine disease, so it didn't seem necessary to test them for other effects. So once it was proven that the vaccines protected against the vaccine disease, well, then any kind of assessment stopped. But with this new knowledge, it's actually time to also go back and look at our current vaccination schedules and say, and really assess whether they're achieving what we want them to achieve, namely improving the overall health of the recipients, not just protecting them against specific diseases.